Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we're reviewing Mortal Kombat. Directed by Simon McQuoid and based off the classic video game, Mortal Kombat stars Lewis Tan as an MMA fighter joining forces with iconic warriors for a multi-dimensional fighting tournament. So Jeffrey, what did you think of Mortal Kombat?
I thought this was kind of stupid. I'm trying to separate. I was thinking about how much I liked Godzilla vs. Kong a couple weeks ago, right? And how, like, the stupidity of that movie didn't bother me at all. But the stupidity of this movie was not enjoyable at all. So I was trying to figure out, like, compare the two and figure out how a blockbuster works for me and how I enjoy them versus how I don't. I think that the main problem here with Mortal Kombat is it's pretending like it's more than it is. Like, it has a tone that's really not fun at all. It's really serious, and it's acting like the stakes are so high, but what's happening plot-wise is so ludicrous that there's this disconnect. I think if it had a tone that was a little more fun, maybe a little bit more funny, where it didn't take itself so seriously, and probably would have been a lot better.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I was extremely disappointed by this movie. I think it all just seemed so meaningless and so pointless. And Godzilla vs. Kong, I think that was a great example to bring up. I wasn't even thinking of that, but I really enjoyed that. But that movie knew it was about the fighting. Yeah. And I think Mortal Kombat was trying, it obviously had a lot of good fighting scenes in it, but it wasn't trying to be just that. It was trying to be more than that. You have this really basic story about this father with his wife and his daughter, and he ends up being roped into this big fight because his lineage, gives him the birthmark of the Mortal Kombat birthmark. Yeah. And so, he's trying to just protect them. And it's just the most basic story, and there's nothing deeper than that.
Yeah, and the stakes of this movie, so the stakes of the tournament are that the other realm, or whatever they're called, are supposed to take over the Earth if the good guys lose the tournament. If they lose it for apparently the 10th time, because they've lost the past 9 times. But all of the stakes of this whole thing, of them taking over the Earth, is mentioned in one throwaway line, where they just kind of say, oh, they'll enslave everybody on Earth and they'll take over, and people are like, oh, shoot, we better win. Like, it doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't earn any of its stakes at all. And the main character in this movie, I can't believe how he's just going along with all this stuff. Like, he goes from being an MMA fighter to within 3 hours, he just accepts that there's this interdimensional tournament. Like, it literally happens in one night, and he's just like, oh yeah, and he's suddenly fighting reptiles and guys that can, I don't know. I understand that this sounds stupid because, what were we expecting out of a Mortal Kombat movie? But it just should have been more fun. I'm not trying to dissect this and say that it needs to be smart or intellectual or anything that's gonna keep me up at night, like, thinking about it, but it needs to do a little bit more. And speaking of this, so you're coming for the fights with Mortal Kombat, right? They're not particularly good.
They're not really that good.
Yeah, they're not really that well choreographed, and they're edited, I think, in a very jumbly way that I couldn't follow them a lot of the time. There's just so little fluidity of the fight scenes, and they're not that interesting except for, like, a couple spots. There's really nothing that original or exciting about them.
Yeah, and for example, there would be characters that come in that just end up dying, and I would feel nothing for their death. It tried to be one of those common movies about good versus evil, light versus dark, and just the same savior character, like the mentor and the savior, and how they all have to come together to defeat this evil. But you don't really feel it because there was no build up to it either. And that's the other main problem of this movie, is that there's absolutely no building blocks to a payoff in this movie. You are thrown into this plot that is just like, you have to save the world. We have to come together. You don't learn pretty much anything about any of the characters except for this very basic, plot device to drive them forward.
Yeah, and a lot of the excitement of the introduction of the characters is really predicated on how much you love Mortal Kombat, which I like Mortal Kombat. I had it when I was a kid, and it was a lot of fun to play. Unless there's this whole subculture that I'm missing, I don't feel like these characters are iconic enough that the whole weight of the moment is based off them showing up.
There was absolutely nothing there to introduce these characters beyond having them show up and then having your memory triggered of like, oh yeah, that's that character from Mortal Kombat. And they look like the character, and they have the same powers as the character in the video game. But that, I really did not like, because I hated that assumption that that's all it would take. Like, all they could do is employ these. Yeah, it was very lazy. Like, all they had to do is use these little nostalgia tricks, like a famous line from one of the characters that they would say in the video game. They would just, all of a sudden, the camera would zoom up on them and they would say it. And you could tell they were playing it for that stupid theater moment where everybody could be like, yeah! And I think just noticing all those mechanics made me not care at all.
It's interesting because I don't know if you've ever seen the Mortal Kombat movies that were made in the 90s. They're notoriously awful. Like, they're corny and ridiculous, but they're actually way more fun to watch than this movie. This movie's arguably better made. Like, it has much better production value. It was clearly, like, cared for more than those movies were, but I would watch those 2 movies from the 90s anytime before this. I could actually, like, laugh at those maybe in some cases, much more so than this movie. This is another thing, kind of going to a different subject about, I think, movies in general that are being made now. I think everybody wants to be Marvel, which is kind of aggravating to me because you never see a movie that you feel like has a complete story. They're just stringing you along to the next one. Whereas Marvel, they are always stringing you along in Marvel, and sometimes that frustrates me, but they do tell a complete story each time. There's just usually little teasers to, hey, make sure you show up for the next one. Whereas I feel like, you know, every movie now needs to build a universe. Like, do we really need a Mortal Kombat universe?
You know, I'm completely fine with building a universe around a different property. I think Mortal Kombat could be one of those universes that would be really well, because I think it's more of an R-rated, more gory. I think there's a place for that. Kind of like Deadpool has a place in where it is in terms of comic book movies, and here in terms of video game adaptations. I think this could have a place and a universe, but I think they just blew it. This movie could have understood itself from the very beginning as being a movie that wasn't about much. That whole light versus dark has been played a million times, but it's how you execute it. It's not how that story has been done so many times. It's about how you change it and make it more exciting for a new generation, not playing off the same mechanics from previous movies that have been done throughout history and reapplying them and assuming you're going to get a result that people are going to enjoy.
Yeah, the other thing too is I feel like you have to give me something. Like, this is a failure on multiple levels. So I keep, you know, if my expectations start here and they keep failing, okay, they're failing me with the characters, and they're failing me with emotional involvement, and then they're failing me with the fights, and it's like you just keep finding something to try and like about it, and I just kept coming up empty every time.
Yeah, the only thing I could say that I like about this movie maybe is the actors. I thought the actors did pretty well with what they had, but the writing was so horrendous in this movie.
Yeah, the dialogue is so wooden and so stilted. Like, there were some lines here that, and I'm not an actor by any means, but I'm just trying to think, I'm like, how would you deliver that line well? It's impossible to deliver that line without it sounding ridiculous.
And it did.
Yeah. So, you ready to go to grades?
Yeah, I'm ready to go to grades. I give this a D.
Oh, I give it a D too.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly. I thought a D- was actually too harsh.
That's what I was just having the math in my head when I took that little pause. That's exactly what I was thinking about.
I was like, D- you have to save for a movie that actually, like, offends you. This movie's not offensive.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like frustratingly mediocre and frustratingly bland.
Yeah, I wanted it to be so much better than it is, and I mean, we've talked about it enough. I mean, that's where I stood, and that's where you stand, I guess, and that's where we are.
So that's a review of Mortal Kombat, which is now streaming on HBO Max and also in theaters. What did you think of this film? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.